was making a note of some of the main questions that came up in the course of this discussion. One is obviously on the business plan, and I would ask Barry Clark to comment on that, because that's more or less a Taylor and Francis call rather than the editorial call. So Barry would talk about that. But before that, some of the main points discussed, the last question that Kennish raised about cross-border research is something that we've been also thinking about, and I would want Shormishta to comment on that. I'll take two specific questions, one raised by Robin and one by Professor Hassan. If you heard Professor Hassan closely, he mentioned 3 or 4 archives or libraries. He mentioned the British Library, he mentioned SOAS, he mentioned the Bodleian. These are the 3 central libraries that he actually referred to in the course of his presentation. Now, and then obviously all of us moved on to talking about what happens to students or people in India. SOAS, British Library, and the Bodleian don't make up the United Kingdom. And this was a point highlighted in the London launch of this archive. Yes, SOAS, yes, the British Library and Cambridge or Oxford may have access to some of these resources. They will, they for sure do. But a lot of the other libraries suffer the same fate within the UK or any other part of the world that students from India or South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh suffer from. They don't have access to primary South Asia material that libraries from these institutions, librarians from these institutions made very clear to us when we did this launch in London, and something that was highlighted in the Times Higher Education Supplement piece on this archive on the 13th of June. So while I absolutely take the point that Professor Hassan made, there is a dimension in the Western context also as to how this library on your desktop can become useful. The second point that Robin, Professor Hassan, and Kennish made about accessibility in South Asia. Let me make this point which sort of departs a little bit, digresses a little bit from this archive. In the course of creating this archive, we have ensured in collaboration with Taylor and Francis that we followed non-destructive scanning. Okay? So all the physical material, some of it has actually been sort of better preserved. And we did a sort of deal with the government of India, with the Human Resource Development Ministry, where we actually went to them and said, we want to donate this entire physical corpus for free. Okay? So the entire physical corpus of 5 million pages of material is actually being donated by us to the government of India to be housed in Delhi as part of the Indian Council of Historical Research, because that's where they want to keep it, wherever they want to keep it, any part of India, not necessarily Delhi. Our point is, as a legacy project, we as part of the South Asia Research Foundation, and having discussed this with Taylor and Francis, we want to donate this material, because for us, it is not our material. It's the country's material, it's legacy material that everybody needs to get access to. So that is another feature or functionality of this archive, that the physical material has been preserved and it will be preserved for posterity. If I could ask you, Shormishta, to talk about the cross-border point that Kennish made before I ask Barry Clark to comment on, I think it's on the business plan.
Yes, the cross-border concept of it. I agree with Kennish that much of the material is material that has come out of India, but at the same time, we have to remember that before 47, and the archive comes up to 1953 because of copyright reasons. So for the greatest part of the archive up to 1947, this is undivided India. And we do have materials from Sindh, Baluchistan, which are now part of Pakistan, Sylhet, Mymensingh, Bangladesh. So we have, if you do have time to more thoroughly search the archive, you will find that we do actually have a fair amount of materials from, regions which are now outside of India and which was then, undivided India. Government reports, gazetteers, other kinds of materials, law, documents relating to law, etc. So, going forward, as Kennish was asking that, is this a one-off or is this going forward as a collaborative project? We do have plans, and, this was, as it is now, conceived, this was phase 1 of the project. And we are now getting very good response from users. So we hope that we will be able to do a further phase and develop this project going forward. We are already in talks with colleagues, librarians based in various parts of the world. And of course, in India, where you have these, private collectors, private libraries with, different levels of holdings. So we are very open to collaboration with other academics, with, librarians, with anyone who's sitting on resources and doesn't want to continue sitting on them, but wants to do something with them. So this is envisaged as a much, much larger project going forward. And in fact, tomorrow we have a meeting with Sarah, and we are talking about this, this aspect of developing this current archive further. So so it has a cross-border element, maybe not as much as some of you would like to see, and that's where the going forward part comes in.
Just one quick point before I ask Barry to comment on the business plan, and then I'll throw it back to my panelists. The meeting that Shomishta mentioned with Sarah tomorrow, we're actually how to develop this forward. So we were thinking of specialized collections. Indian film has become a subject of much interest in every part of the world. And we have now sourced, anyone who sort of follows Indian film will know how difficult it is to get primary material relating to Indian cinema. We now have, there were original film pamphlets that used to come out in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. We now have close to about 1,000 plus. We have 1,000 plus of these original film pamphlets, memorabilia, ephemera as part of this archive, which we now want to add as specialized collections going forward. I personally have built up a significant amount of material, again, collaborating with other researchers on sport and on cinema, which Shomishta has built. So that's basically the way forward. Obviously, it has to be opened up for other academics and researchers. It is not our archive, it is your archive. Everybody needs to contribute to this. Unless it becomes a community project by South Asian academics for South Asian academics in every part of the world. This is not the end result. 5 million pages is just the start. If you really think about it, who knows? I mean, the world is our oyster. So that's the whole motto of the South Asia Archive, that to take it forward, to try and make South Asia a region where research becomes easy. It is no longer an excuse to say we did not have access to material. That problem needs to be done away with. That is the fundamental principle on which the South Asia Archive is premised. Barry, could I ask you to please talk about the business plan?
Sure. Okay. Well, as you can see, the archive is a very complex, very new thing for Tony Francis to be involved in, and as Kennish quite rightly said, in fact, the whole publishing industry is engaged in a process of change at the moment. We are constantly looking at ways of making our journal publishing, our book publishing work in the new ecosystem in which we find ourselves, with debates about open access, for example, in the journal publishing world, debates about the pricing of paperbacks in the book publishing world, and very much, like Kennish knows, because we've worked together on the pricing of some of his books in the past, we are very responsive to the need to price material according to market needs. One of the issues with this archive, the South Asia Archive, is that it is a very fluid, a very dynamic resource. How can we put a value on what we've done so far? How can we put a value on that sense of wonder, that sense of discoverability, the excitement that you might find as you sit at your desk researching something, and then something pops up which is just going to take your research into a brand new direction, perhaps save hours of work, perhaps save trips to India, to Pakistan to do the field research. How can you put a value on that? How can you put a value on the digitization process? 5 million pages, not only digitized, but then properly archived. All the linkages that we provided, the technology behind this requires a tremendous investment. How can you put a value on that? We obviously are a commercial publisher. We don't pretend to be otherwise. We do seek to make money out of everything that we do. I'd be lying if I said anything else. But we know as publishers that unless we get the balance right, that we will literally cease to exist. We only exist as publishers because academia want us to make their research accessible in some way. So finding a value, finding the right price point on this is going to be a challenge. And you may be therefore not surprised to hear that there is no price that I can suddenly reveal. There's no slide I'm about to show that, and this is the price. $44, $32 if you put your order in now. It's just not like that. We are entering into negotiations with libraries, with research institutes around the world as I speak. In fact, we have Zhang Wei from the National Library of China, who's come from Beijing specifically for this very first launch of the South Asia Archive in Asia, to hear about the resource and to hopefully report back to her colleagues in Beijing the value that they will be able to extract on behalf of the National Library of China. National University of Singapore, maybe I could argue the world's greatest university, certainly in South Asian studies, certainly has aspirations to be up there amongst the top universities in the world. It already is top 30 without doubt in terms of this subject area, much higher than that. How can you put a value on the kind of benefits that the researchers and the undergraduates here in the US will get from accessing the South Asia Archive? We are going to be very flexible going forward. There are discussions around subscription models, there are discussions around payment over periods of time, but we're not in a stage where we can actually put a price tag on this. And because of the dynamic nature of the relationships between Boria, Chamistra and the editors, between Taylor and Francis and several of our key partners around the world, it could be that the collaboration that we've hinted at could be built into the value, the price that an institution pays. I don't know if that's going to be possible to actually formulate that, but it may indeed be part of the negotiation process going forward. All I would say about the National University of Singapore, we're trying to work on a trial very soon. The university here has been very supportive of all our other digital resources, so I'm very confident that we will be able to find a middle ground where we will be able to make this research available. Thank you.
I'll add to that. I know that Taylor and Francis are already in discussions with the University Grants Commission in India, because the idea was to try and make it as accessible as possible. I personally have had several meetings with the chairman of the University Grants Commission, Professor Ved Prakash, who was part of the Delhi launch in November of last year, when very senior delegation from Taylor and Francis were in India in trying to sort of have discussions with their Indian counterparts, with Professor Prakash, some of his colleagues, as to how to make this resource widely available. I can say that some Indian universities have already made this resource available. One of them, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, they have already made this resource available to students in JNU. Some other universities from around the world have also already made this resource available. A couple of them come to mind straight away: University of British Columbia. Interestingly, the University of Tripura, which do not straight away come to mind as to why University of Tripura, but it has. I know about 100 or so libraries are trialing the resource. As far as prices are concerned, I don't have a say, nor am I privy to that, but I can tell you that as an academic, being on the other side, I would want this to be accessed by as many researchers and as many students and as many academics as possible. That was the fundamental principle on which this is premised. Yes, I absolutely appreciate the investment that has gone in, but at the same time, it has to be a balance, as Barry rightly emphasized. It is a legacy project as far as we are concerned. So, there has to be a lot of discussion as to how this can be made available to the maximum possible number of academics, faculty members, researchers, and students in every part of the world. Robin, a question to you and a question for Professor Hassan. When you now play with the archive, having been a researcher for the last 35 years, I mean, including a recent book on the cell phone, just talk a bit about how this can change the scope of research. I mean, when you do classroom teaching, how does that sort of a resource like this impact? I mean, because we keep talking about undergraduates need to have access to primary data. This actually does that. So does it really help in sort of enabling students for a career in academia?
I now know what a MOOC is. A MOOC is a massive open online course, which is the very fashionable thing in economical tertiary education. The big universities around the world are looking to, I think, do an awful lot of MOOC teaching. But the idea of the MOOC, I gather, is not, as I say, just to put lectures on web pages, but to create this interactivity. But Boria, it will depend, in terms of undergraduate teaching, it will depend on the imagination of teachers in how they can use this. In the hands of an adult teacher, it will simply be another boring document that students are forced to look at. In the hands of a career teacher, it could be a very exciting thing that would have links that would lead elsewhere. I think good undergraduate and secondary education is going to require good teachers to also be reasonably good technicians, or at least for schools to have some pretty classy technicians working with good teachers to make the interactivity that this could bring as fruitful as it could be in the hands of the right sort of teacher. Kennish is teaching regularly. He'd have some better ideas about what's available now in the technical side of undergraduate teaching.
Ganesh, if you could also comment a little bit on, will this make the subject areas of research more broad-based? I mean, for example, research on sport, say with 10 years back, was very, very primitive in that sense in South Asia, right? I mean, still it is not one of the more known areas of research. Will this actually sort of broaden the scope of research per se?
I think so, Boria. I think so. Of course, one of the things to be said is that this is not official archives. We are moving away from our official archives in some ways. And I think there is a great deal to be said about that, given the sort of direction of South Asian history writing. So this is really opening up the range of fields, and sports is one. Of course, I know, the work you and Nalin have done, Kaushik's book on football in Bengal is a wonderful example, more recently. But I think as the new generation, I think it's really the new generation. It's not so much, people like me and Robin who struggled in different archives and now are discovering the joys of digital resources. But it's really the younger people who are thinking about South Asian studies as a field beyond the undergraduate years into their masters, into their PhD, what they can discover. And I think this is where it can be a wonderfully enticing journey where there is a whole range of resources which become available on cities, on consumption, on lifestyles, cinema, sports, media, and so on. So I think in terms of the sort of broadening of the field, in terms of concerns and interests, this makes it more exciting. But on the other side, how far can this go? Of course, as Sharmishta, I think, put her finger on this by saying that this is not it prepares you to go into the physical archives, right? You will still need large bodies of materials. If you are writing a book on, say, I'm thinking of Gyan Pandey's book on peasants in UP. You would need that kind of resources, which provide a systematic body of material, either the papers of an institution or private papers, or a body of government reports which enable you to build up a narrative which can be sustained over 80,000 words, which is normally a PhD thesis.
Correct.
So I think this is where it may encourage a younger set of scholars to take the risk, go further, to push the boundaries and see what is possible. But at the same time, I think they have to be aware of what are the challenges which lie further down the road, I think. But in terms of coming back to undergraduate teaching, I think very much so. At a honors level class, you can point students to primary sources, introduce them to primary sources at a much earlier stage. And I think increasingly within our own university, we see it's no longer a delivery of content. It's really research skills, thinking skills, critical thinking, which is encouraged. And I think this is happening fairly effectively. At least the effort is there. Very, very much the effort is there. Whether the outcome is there, it's probably not for us to say. But in that respect, I think undergraduate teaching has changed from content delivery to research skills, critical thinking, writing, and I think this is where this is very timely, and very valuable.
I'll ask one question of Professor Hassan and then open it up for questions. So please feel free to formulate your questions, ask any of the panelists or Barry or Sarah or me, whatever you want to ask. I mean, if you want to check for a particular subject area of research field, please tell us and we'll do that live for you. Sir, you mentioned the state of research in Pakistan. I mean, we had a very clear thinking that, Islam and Pakistan, and there's so much interest in that subject area at this point in time in the world. Tried to put as much material as possible. Do you think that sort of, addition of a new corpus of material which will become accessible to a global range of scholars will actually help in understanding features of, say, Islam or how it is interpreted? Secondly, it is a request more than a question. You said the state of archives in Pakistan are not very good, and Kennish made the point about collaboration. Please do point us to possible aspects of collaboration within Pakistan, because this is not a one-off project for Taylor and Francis. I'm sure they would want to take this forward. They are exploring opportunities of collaboration. So please do point us to possibilities of collaboration within Pakistan with particular archives or institutions or individuals who would want to collaborate.
Thanks very much. No, I think I really don't know the archives, because I'm sorry, I'm a boring sociologist, not an exciting historian. So and I go and collect my data, and then I make some sense of the world in which we live. I think there is but what I do know, the conditions of the library in Pakistan is not very good, and I think making particularly historical material, I mean, they don't have contemporary journals and books, and I think to have access to rare books like that you have in your archives would be almost beyond their reach now, until now, and I think it's possible now to imagine. So I just give you an example. Many years ago, I was teaching in Indonesia. Of course, that's not in South Asia, but this is a comparable example. There were 41 universities at that time, public universities, and only 2, University of Indonesia and Gajah Mada University, had proper libraries, and they were not proper at all. I mean, they were really very, very limited libraries. And I remember visiting one university somewhere in the region. There were 5,000 students and 5,000 books in the library. I mean, if you consider that I've been teaching from Singapore, I went to Adelaide Flinders University in Adelaide, and we have students body about 10,000, and we have 2 million books in our library. So you can see the scale of what I'm talking about. Let me go back to your previous question. I think the question that Ganesh pointed out was absolutely marvelous. There is a burden of history in South Asia. South Asia is the most unintegrated region in the whole world. It's almost beyond my comprehension why it is that countries in South Asia are still carry on the burden of history. And I think the only way you can perhaps try to overcome is to provide, open the avenues for them to communicate to knowledge. And I think the cross-border part of this archives is going to be very, very valuable. It would be, I've been trying to get visa to go to India, and I tell you, it's an exercise to get a visa. My son, who was born in Singapore, if he wants to apply a visa, used to work in London, and he used to call me and said, why is it that I can't go to India? They said, your father was a Pakistani citizen. And I really used to be, I raised it with Indian politicians. I said, my son has nothing to do. He used to live in England, and he was working for an Indian company, and he still had difficulty, 6 weeks visa to go to India. So I'm just saying that for scholars, it's the same thing. So I think in some ways, if integration, intellectual integration, let's say economic and intellectual integration, and this is just one of the, perhaps an example of how the integration can occur in South Asia. Now, I just wanted to make 1 or 2 very quick points. One is I thought the subject area can be refined. You have very broad categories, and I think in those broad categories, you probably, perhaps with appropriate consultation with your colleagues and academics, you can probably make it a bit more, refine it in such a way that people like myself, for example, interested in certain areas on society and society or religion or architecture would be able to have access to. the teaching, you know, I'm a pre-IT generation. I still have struggled. I have to call some of my younger colleagues to come and tell me how to fill out online forms. And I think it's part of your, if you want to really succeed with it, you have to actually try to get hold of the universities and ask them to teach the teachers how to actually use this kind of material. I think most importantly, as one of the observations made, Robert was saying that if you can make teachers just use of this archives friendly and exciting for students, I'm sure the students will be very excited. Students are very, very interested in going and learning more, and I think that's part and parcel of that should be to try to actually provide faculties in the universities and also teachers training colleges to how to actually make use of this, how to make this an exciting tool in teaching. I just wanted to specifically to your question about Islam, I think much of the Islamic scholarship, the word of Islam is a very complex word. I mean, if you want to, if you're studying Islam, the first thing they will say, oh, do you know Arabic? Which is nonsense, because most of the Muslims are not Arabic speaking now. I mean, out of 1.6 billion Muslims, one third live in India and Pakistan and South Asia. And in fact, only 300 to 400 million Muslims actually speak Arabic. In fact, most of the Muslims don't speak Arabic, and I think that's one of the enemy. So in a way, I think what is important is to try to look at the Muslim world and look at the scholarship which is actually now emerging and try to see if you can digitize. I myself feel that there probably enough material available in the contemporary Islam. I mean, you probably would be better off, but I think it is the English, Urdu, Persian, Hindi, Indonesian. They are the main languages which are spoken by the majority of Muslims, and I think Islamic studies in those languages would be very, very useful. I just wanted to share with you my experience of using libraries. I've been very afraid of a librarian in all my life, and I've tried to be extremely respectful to them, and I'm still very afraid of them. So, but my librarian friends tell me that they don't accept anymore. I wanted to donate my books when I finished this. I decided to resign. We don't have now retirement, so when I left my position as professor of sociology, I wanted to give my books. They didn't want to take them. They said, no, we don't want them. We don't have any. Basically, they are not looking for hard copies anymore. They are actually looking for, they want e-books, they want electronic versions. But they did take some of them, but they were kind enough not to tell me that they threw most of them away after they didn't, the books they didn't want. But what I want to say is that libraries in Australia, for example, are actually are becoming more and more friendly, are being able to using digitized versions, electronic versions. And I think one of the suggestions I would have that in order to make it accessible to, for example, students in Australia, a library can subscribe to the archives, and of course then almost everybody has access to it. I'm afraid this is in which user pay principle has to apply. I mean, I was looking for an article, my own article in a journal which appeared in London. I had to pay £14 to buy it because I couldn't actually ask somebody to send it to me, and I've forgotten. So we do actually end up paying for the, I mean, if I want to buy something, if I want to read an article from New York Review of Books or London Review of Books, I have to now pay them. So I'm not really so concerned about payment, but certainly that payment can be in such a way. Oxford, for example, I remember they have differential pricing. Same book, one of my books, I remember they were selling $35 in UK, I think $39 in Australia, $5 in India, $7 in India and Pakistan. So I think you probably may, I don't know how they actually do that. But certainly Oxford actually, and I know the same thing, I think Cambridge does it, but I definitely know the Oxford because I have bought my own books and my other books in India in Pakistan, which were actually fraction of the price than I paid in the United States. So this is something that you...
Routledge does that too? I mean, it's the same book which is priced at say £20 in the UK and for in India.
Only some.
Only some.
I have
Yeah,
published 2 books with Routledge, and they are both very expensive. And I actually got one good thing I must say to Routledge when I published my book on suicide terrorism. First, I mean, it was £86. I said, look, for heaven's sake, nobody's going to buy it. But they were very they were at least thoughtful enough to say, okay, we'll publish a small book, a paperback, you know, the 1/3 of the, you know, and in fact they published. They asked me to write another book, which was essentially a sort of a shorter version of my book, and I was very pleased that they published. And it's only a fraction of the price, about £10 or £12. So in a way, I think Routledge books are expensive.
Yes.
They are only published for the libraries. I don't think the consumer, the average student buys it, but I think this is something you have to look at yourself.
That's correct, and you've given me an example, and with Kennish we did an example of your partition in South Asia, where we can be flexible, but we really need to be in a dialogue with academics to ensure that that process follows through. So yes, that's proof that we can be flexible.
Questions? Just raise your hands and introduce yourself and ask whatever you want to ask. Anyone? Yes?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Kunur Kripalani.
Microphone.
I'm Kunur Kripalani from the University of Hong Kong. I was wondering, with this particular e-format, is it possible to download images and credit like you would with, not images you don't do from a book, but say bits of text and so on?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you
And reproduce in articles?
I think you probably need to have permission
Permissions?
to reproduce, but you can certainly download them. Download articles and download chapters or the entire document.
And what does one do for images, for instance?
The same. So you can download all images.
And we get permission from you?
You have to ask
permission,
permission.
yeah, for reproduction.
I'd be interested to hear what the subscriptions are for these.
Sure. We'll be talking to the universities in Hong Kong very soon.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
My name is Parthasarathi from the South Asian Studies program. You know, I have a slightly different question pertaining to accessibility. Sarah mentioned that these are all high-resolution images. Now, you know, the world of archives is something that's completely closed to those who are visually impaired, and digital material is likely to open up a whole new world to them. So, just wanted to know whether this is in a format which is recognized by screen reading software and can be made available so that you know, people who are visually impaired can use that software to read this material.
Sorry, what software?
There's something, you have OCR, screen reading software,
yes.
which visually
Yeah,
impaired
yes.
people use.
Yes.
So, but you know, the usually scanned material cannot be read by the screen reading software. So whether this is in a format which can be recognized by that software.
Yes, it can be. So
Can
it has,
be.
Yeah, and it has been OCR'd.
It can be OCR, okay.
Yes.
It has been. It has been because each and every page, it's not only scans. So there, each and every page has been keyed in, has been OCR'd, and you know, sort of effort has been ensured to sort of get it to as much possible correctness. We've got something like 98 or something like that percentage. I would not be able to tell you offhand, but definitely that's the case. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Kali Nisaniratna from NTU. Yeah, it's about this cross-border issue, because as a Sri Lankan, now very much when you talk about South Asia, always India dominates, of course, the size 15. Because I'm part of a forum of Sri Lankan intellectuals, mainly Buddhists and Sinhalese, and we are concerned about the misrepresentation of Sri Lanka in many ways around the world. There's been a huge propaganda campaign. And we have been looking at how Sri Lankan traditional knowledge could be more internationalized. For example, the history of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, when Buddhism declined in India, it was Sri Lanka which nurtured the Mahavihara tradition coming from Nalanda, writing of Tripitaka in Sri Lanka, from which Buddhism spread to Southeast Asia. So there would be a lot of knowledge, very important knowledge for the international community there. I'm not sure how organized the National Archives in Sri Lanka is, because I haven't lived there for a long time. But the network we have, there's a lot of the members are in Sri Lanka. So I was just wondering whether the National Archives there could cooperate with your project to get more Sri Lankan material into it.
Absolutely yes. I mean, the first answer is absolutely yes. And I personally did visit the National Archives in Sri Lanka with another colleague, Professor Michael Roberts from Adelaide. This was about a couple of years back. We were talking in terms of collaboration when Michael was in Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar in the 1960s, 1965, 66, 67. He had done quite a bit of work with original primary material coming out of Sri Lanka, including building up a photo archive, a visual archive. And I had long discussions with Michael as to how we can get the visual archive to become a part of the South Asia archive. It's still a conversation in progress, but as I said, I mean, very, very interested in, I keep going to Sri Lanka for my own personal work, have been there several times, including close to a month last year, were in discussion. So in short, absolutely, if you put us in touch with more people, your network of academics, and I'm sure Tiller and Francis would be as interested as we are.
And we do have, just to add to that, of course it's up to the scholars and students using these materials in their work to see how they interpret them. But from the archives perspective, we do have materials relating to Sri Lanka. For instance, I just did an instant search when you were talking, and there's the Proceedings of the Convention of Religions in India from 1909. And this does have some materials relating to Buddhism and the area of Sri Lanka. We have, for instance, the Tropical Agriculturist, which came out of Ceylon. So we do have materials from Sri Lanka, and then it's up to the academics concerned how they will use them and interpret them.
Other questions? Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about each of the individual archive materials that are part of this? So I understand it's coming from your point about the OCRs. If, for instance, the Niveda document that's in front of us, what kind of search terms would be pulled up to find this kind of document? I understand the very basic parameters of the search, but even with what's in front of us, the Great Fire of London, 1667, I mean, is it that level of detail within a text of specificity? Or is it sort of more general that you've added identifiers onto each of the individual archives or texts? If you could say a little bit more about actually the searchability of that archive.
That's a very good question. All three of us would have a little bit to say on that.
Okay, so all of the documents have been OCR'd, so whatever search term you search for, if there's a result within the archive, that will come up. So if you searched for the Great Fire of London, if you did a phrase search for that, then that would show up in that document and other documents. All of the metadata as well is searchable, so results will be returned for the metadata too, as well as the actual text within the documents.
The idea was to make it full text searchable, okay, rather than keywords. And when Barry mentions cost implications, that was one fundamental principle, because if you just do keywords, and you very well know, I mean, you shake your head, because it was one minuscule thing. If you just do scans, like say take JSTOR for example, you don't get that. So the idea was, are we going the distance? Do we have the money? And we did. Yes, for Sanskrit material, you cannot break it down. I mean, it's Unicodes, you cannot break that down. It doesn't exist. We even tried that. With technology, we tried sort of 9 different ways to break the Sanskrit material down, it wasn't possible. But for other material, English language material, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the fundamental principles, that try and make it as full text searchable as possible.
May I please ask?
Yeah, please.
The searchable time frames that I noticed when it popped up on the screen was 1700 to
1953.
1953. What do you have from the 1700s?
We had a list of this.
We have some religious Vaishnava treatises, which are some of the earliest materials, then materials coming out of the Asiatic Society, which are the earliest. We have some Bengali journals, and it actually gets more dense as we move towards 1800.
But the early Asiatic Society material, 1784 was when William Jones did it, but the Asiatic researchers go back to 1788, so there's stuff from there, which actually, early 19th century material, 1800s plus, I don't think the Asiatic Society has them
No,
anymore.
they don't.
Because we went to the Calcutta office to check if they have that material, which doesn't exist. So there is a lot of Asiatic Society material, Indology material, that stuff, that there is part of the archive. Yes, sir? A question there and the question here.
Just wanted a simple question. Do you also have audio and video material from before 1953?
No. Audio and video, again, something that we want to do.
Watch the space.
Watch the space. But audio, video, definitely something that we want to do. The lady there. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of relates to what he just said. I was just wondering how much of oral history records are being included in this, because that is also one of the rich archival sources.
You are absolutely correct.
Catch them before they die.
100%. I'll give you one specific example of something that I had an experience of. This was just a couple of weeks back. In Bombay, I was chairing a session on cricket. And the gentleman there, sitting in the very front row, was a guy called Madhav Mantri. He's 92 years old and is the oldest surviving test cricketer now in the world. Okay, so I made a reference to a tour, an Australian tour of India, 1945-46. And I was generally talking, like now, I was talking about this tour, and suddenly this man raises his hand. So automatically, 92, yes. And he said, I was captain of that team. And I was completely taken aback that this man is actually saying I was captain of that team. I left it right then and said, so do you want to say anything? He remembers everything. And then he comes to Tendulkar. And, and he the whole audience was completely taken by what he said. He said he was the manager of the first tour where Tendulkar got 100 in 1990. And then went on to say, much about Tendulkar's mortal fear of facing the press. Now, all of this material is not known. And if Madhav Mantri dies, it will be lost forever. So my first thought was, this man needs to be interviewed. And wearing my media hat, because I do a lot of television and radio and print, I recorded it. But as a conscious policy, oral history is fascinating. I just gave you one particular example, but it has to be done.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Just to add to that, yes, of course, we are completely on the same page with you about oral history, and as I said, you have to keep watching this space, and we hope sincerely that we are able to expand on this in many ways, increase document types. For instance, we don't have newspapers here now because that involved an entirely different process of the mechanism of digitization, etc. But we might do it later. We might do private papers, so we might do oral history, we might do visual things. For instance, my own interest is film. And, I have made some recordings of people. For instance, Shami Kapoor, he just passed away recently. And, so there are people from the 60s generation who are now going, but some of them are still there. So, to record and be able to just put them up there is, I think, very important. And it will depend on, how we move forward, but we are definitely open to doing that kind of thing. So we hope we are able to.
Just final points. The Shomishta mentioned visual material. Ganesh's point about cross-border collaboration. I'm actually in talks with somebody from Pakistan who works part-time with the Pakistan Cricket Board. He's got a fantastic visual archive. We were actually talking in terms of a collaboration between India and Pakistan about a visual history of India-Pakistan cricket if we make it part of this. I think it will be unbelievably interesting. He has material from the 1930s, which was India, Pakistan together, and then when Pakistan started playing in 1947. I've got material going back to the 1880s. So if we could sort of collaborate and get an India-Pakistan visual archive together, I think it would be fascinating. Other questions? Yes, madam? Yes, I'll come to you.
So my question is about the searchability of images. I was wondering if pictures from within books are individually tagged, such that you could search images of Gali and get something from out of a book.
So yeah, you can search within the PDF. So once you download a PDF, then you can apply your search. So you can actually search within documents themselves. Is that what you're asking?
No, like if I don't know what documents have the images that I want, and I just want to look for images of a certain content or a certain subject matter, can I put that in?
Yeah, you can, once you've downloaded it. So once you've downloaded the image, then you can search it.
So I would still need to know which sort of books have that picture.
Okay, so you'd run a basic search or an advanced search, and then once you've got the list of documents, then you can run a separate search within that particular document.
The lady there, if you could pass the microphone. We've still got about 5 more minutes, so 10 more minutes. So please, a few more questions. I'll come to you, sir.
I was just wondering two things. The date range.
Yes.
What period does the archive cover? And also, do you have, rich resources on gender and women in India? Because of a current book that I'm trying to write, and it's always very hard to get materials. I can always, I'm a sociologist, and I can always go and do interviews, but
correct.
That's a very different thing from trying to get, say, I was trying to look at the legal history of women's movements and things in India, and I was wondering how I could find things like that. Thank you.
Mr. Will you take that?
Yes, we have. We actually have one of our subject heads is gender, which is primarily women. We have lots of material on women's education. You'll find lots of reports on women's education relating to law. You'll find actually all these, these proceedings of court cases, and you'll find how many of them were these widows going to court to fight with their own relatives over their property, their husband's property. So that kind of thing. And of course, women's education, we have, I don't know if you read Bengali or not, lots of Bengali journals, but otherwise also, lots of the English journals also, articles on women throughout the 19th century, and the rest of the 20th century that we come up to. So we have, you just have to spend some time there and, play around with it. But we have lots of reports on women, journal articles, lots of it, documents relating to law. So you just have to spend some time, searching there. But we are very women heavy, yeah.
And what time period?
The date range is 1700 to 1953, though the bulk of the material would be, say, from the early 19th to the 1950s. So basically, say, from 1800 onwards to 1953. You want to add anything, Shomishta? Okay, to add to what she said, there were 4 different courts, Calcutta, Bombay, Allahabad and Madras. And material was published as part of these, the recorder, the reports between 1875 and onwards. We've got entire collections, okay? There was, weekly reports, there's sort of compendiums. This is a very strong law archive, very, very strong, because we acquired them sort of over time, and I think one of the fundamental strengths of this archive would be law. And so definitely do take a look.
And there's also one interesting aspect, we often hear this about India or South Asia, that women don't, report rape cases and that kind of thing. You'll be surprised how many of these, court cases were about women, going to court about modesty being outraged and that kind of thing, abduction, rape. So, as I said, you have to be, know what you're searching for, so you have to.
Sir, yeah, I'll come to you. Maybe 4 more questions, 1, 2 and 2 more.
Just 2 brief questions. One, what are the prospects of your going beyond 1953? The other is that will you have an interface with libraries like the Nehru Memorial, which have and which are also building oral histories of a very fascinating kind? And the third is that there is a lot of material in the oral history archives of the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations, which may be of relevance and which will sort of throw an interesting spin on global-local interactions that might sort of make your archive, enrich your archive.
The third point is more for Barry and your team to take note of, and which we should pursue the lead. The first one, 1953, because of copyright reasons, but our intention, we are in talks with certain societies, certain institutions to take permission, because there are certain journals which were started, say for example in the 1910s or 20s, and came up right up to the 1980s, 90s. We've got them from the 1910s, 20s up to 53, but we are in talks with them to allow us to digitize the full run. Film ephemera, issues where there are no copyright issues, we can bring them as sort of close to now as possible. The physical archive comes right up to today. We've got loads of material in the physical archive, in the South Asia Research Foundation archive. So as and when we get permission, we will bring it forward for sure. The second point about Nehru Memorial and other libraries, we are open to talks and collaboration with anybody. With, Professor Hassan said his personal collection, or Ganesh mentioned particular libraries, librarians, communities, institutions, for sure. Because as I said, this is not a one-off resource. I'm sure Taylor and Francis, this is a product line for them. This is a project line which will go forward. So I'm sure Nehru Memorial Museum, I think a presentation was made to Mushirul Hassan at the National Archives. I think a meeting was done at the Nehru Memorial. I don't have details about what transpired in that meeting, but for sure, there will be attempts to try and collaborate as widely as possible. Yes, the lady there.
You did, I'm just tempted to kind of use the hands-on thing, and if you could search for women and Malaya,
sure.
Because it comes from an interest, as in when I began the research, I was told women don't exist in the archives, and to what I found about women is extensive. So.
Absolutely. While we search, 2 other questions. Got 5 minutes. Any other question? Yes?
I was wondering about plans for other languages, especially Punjabi.
What was the other search term?
Women.
Malaya and women.
Indian.
Malaya.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
That's it.
Research.
Okay, so there's
1,528 hits now. How much of this is directly relevant to your thing, you'll have to play with, just like Professor Hassan mentioned. But yes, there's loads on women.
See, there's something on abortion and infanticide that just came up in your thing.
This one. See? Committing abortion and infanticide. The women laying Pandharpur and the infant with or without money presence, etc.
Whatever.
So there'll be loads. You just need to play with and find out for details. Other languages, difficult. You know why? Because this archive has been personally sourced, and that's why we are so confident about the context of this, and the material is valuable. We, as editors, we speak Hindi, Bengali, and English. Don't speak Punjabi. As and when Taylor and Francis expand this, we get other academics on board, which is the point, which is what we want to do going forward. But till then, in the physical archive, we have Gujarati, we have Tamil, we have other languages. We do already have, but we don't know how rare the material is, because we can't understand. We know that the material goes back to the early 20th century. We know that, we can read dates, etc. But we don't know how significant the material is, which is why it has not been included as part of this collection. But going forward, at some point in time, I'm pretty sure that there will be other languages. Final question?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about accessing stuff that are held by smaller local universities or colleges? Like, for example, the London Metropolitan University. These universities have resources which are very specific to specific fields, but they are very rich. Would you be interested in
See, that's more a question for Taylor and Francis rather than us as editors. I'm sure they would be. But when you say colleges, and I'd sort of digress from that question a bit and answer, one of our interests was schools and colleges. If you check this archive, you'll find loads of schools and college magazines. I'll give you 2 particular examples. Presidency College, Calcutta, where both of us went to. If you go to the college today, the library is in shambles. The college magazine, which goes back to the 1880s, early 1900s, was a fantastic resource for material. Doesn't exist. This archive has loads of that. So you can actually, St. Xavier's College Magazine, Presidency College Magazine, loads of other college magazines, school magazines. So there is a particular focus on school college magazines as part of this archive, which I think is extremely valuable for South Asia research. I did a compilation of sports material coming out of Presidency College magazine, which, for example, I did not even know exists. So that standpoint, it is relevant. But for other institutions like LMU, London Metropolitan, I'm sure Barry and team, I mean, your UK counterparts would be interested in collaboration.
Indeed, I'm sure. So I'd like to take the conversation forward, possibly.
Yeah, thank you for the lead. And if anyone else has any other suggestions, please do come to me in the reception and let me know, and I'll take them down. Thank you.
No, I was just a minor point really when we talk about materials coming out of colleges and smaller educational institutions. Historically, it's not as if we only have a Presidency and St. Xavier's, which are elite, metropolitan, but we have colleges like Rajshahi College, which doesn't exist anymore, which is from the 30s, and it's now in Bangladesh actually. So we have also these very non-elite, smaller, mufassil educational institutions and materials which have come out of there. So we've tried to be as diverse as we can. This was the first phase of the project, and that 50 lakh or 5 million pages was a big ask. It was the first phase, but we are very happy to go forward. So we hope we are able to do that.
From the number of questions, I think we've had a successful workshop, and I'm deeply indebted to all my panelists and to all of you for coming together, sharing the last 1.5 hours with us, with your insights, giving us critical pointers going forward. So on that note, may I please ask you and all of us to put your hands together for Kennish Kudesia, Professor Niyaz Hassan, Robin Jeffrey, Sarah Phillips, and the entire team. This I did not know about, so I would hand over to Barry.
Sure. Yes, I'd just like to echo that. Thanks indeed. Thank you very much. Kennish, thank you so much. Totally appreciation of your hard work. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you very hard. All right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming. Please don't run away. You probably heard that the gods are as excited about the South Asia Archive as we are. So please don't run away and get wet. Please stay and interact. We have also in the room publishers, books and journal publishers. So if anyone's got any ideas about new content they'd like to talk to us about, please do. And please do stay for some refreshments outside now. Thank you very much for coming. Well,